Resuming debate, reprise de débat, the honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As always, it's a great honour to rise in this House and represent the people of Timmins, James Bay. We are here today to ask for a simple thing, that the government that has lost track of $3.1 billion admit that they lost track of the money and work with us and bring forward the documents so we can find out what happened to the money. However, we've heard from the government, we've heard a number of fascinating euphemisms. The money wasn't lost, it just hasn't been found. The money's horizontal. Perhaps that means it's under someone's bed. We heard that it will materialize. I don't know, are they expecting it to just appear at some given time? What it speaks to, Mr. Speaker, is the sheer level of defiant incompetence within this government. I remember in 2006, when they replaced the Liberal Party, and they made a promise to Canadians. At that time, Canadians were frustrated with years of the arrogance of the Liberal Party and the numerous scandals. And the Conservative government party at the time made a promise that they would come in and they would clean up Ottawa. It was a simple promise. It was going to be, they would bring a standard of ethics back to Ottawa. But that's not what's happened. What we've seen is this level of defiant immaturity on the most basic issues of public policy. It's like they've created this carnival circus of spite and mediocrity, and they have attacked all the existing standards of transparent accountability that is essential for ensuring democratic foundations. And we see at the center of a lot of these scandals is the present Treasury Board president, who bragged about destroying Canada's long-form census. And he said at the committee hearings, if one person in the country objected, just one person, that would be enough to destroy this system that was gold standard for gathering information around the world. Well, then they came out with Bill C-30, which showed they were more than willing to intrude on the privacy of Canadians. In fact, they were going to spy on Canadians. They thought that was perfectly fine. We now see that their decision with the long-form census shows, again, a level of managerial incompetence that is staggering. We see the same with the fact that he took $50 million of border infrastructure money and blew it on the most outrageous and needless projects, the gazebos, the sunken boat. He invested money in a sunken boat, putting a lighthouse in the forests of northern Ontario, while telling senior citizens that the cupboard was bare, while telling senior citizens who are living on poverty, I'm sorry, these are tough times, but that member took money that was meant for border infrastructure security and blew it in his riding. We now find out there's $2.1 billion of secret contracts being shoveled out the back door, again happening under the Treasury Board watch. They're not even meeting the basic guidelines. They're taking money without any sense of accountability. And now we have $3.1 billion gone missing. And the Conservatives are saying, well, don't worry, it was all spent well. But they can't tell us where it was spent. That's not a standard for accountability, Mr. Speaker. I think when Canadians watch this government, they're saying, what is happening in this nation? People don't expect government to do everything. They expect the government should play a role at times when people need them, on issues like pensions, on issues like infrastructure, on issues like health care. That's the role of government, is to maintain a good standard of public policy that is accountable, that is transparent, that can meet international norms. They expect, yes, and they expect government to unify, to bring people across this great country together. But what we've seen in this carnival circus of spite and mediocrity is that sneering has replaced leadership, that the 140-character attack has replaced debate. We're seeing that this sense of political mendacity is being moved throughout every level of this government, through their committees, through their backbenches. And I haven't even mentioned the fact that they're actually spending millions of Canadians' taxpayers' dollars to keep tabs on their own backbenchers. It's a level of suspicion and wastefulness that's staggering. I think the other thing, Mr. Speaker, is that when we see their attacks on science, when we see their attacks on international institutions, Canada once had a reputation as a country that was a model of openness and decency. Instead now, under this government, Canada is becoming a stranger to the world, a place that is where this government responds with suspicion and distrust. And when representatives come who are from the United Nations, they get ridiculed. I will be sharing my time with the member for Welland, Mr. Speaker, just to clarify that we see the Conservative backbench ridiculing members of the United Nations who are dealing with the fact that in the far north, in the health minister's riding, for example, people can't afford food. And the government attacks. They attack the international institutions. They've shut down rights and democracy. They've shut down the round table on the economy and the environment. They've attacked relentlessly the role of the parliamentary budget officer, whose primary job was to provide documents to Parliament. They have turned this House of Commons into a place where the role of the MP to hold government to account has been shut down through efforts to shut down debate time and time again. And what that's left with, Mr. Speaker, is this culture of arrogance that they believe that they are entitled to their entitlements. They believe that their friends like Mike Duffy and Patrick Brazo can get away with things because they're Conservatives. It is a level of arrogance that even outstrips something that the Liberals had, and I think that that's staggering, and it's an insult to the Canadian people who were promised that they would do government differently. So now we have $3.1 billion. That's incompetence. That's incompetent management when the Treasury Board president says, I don't know where the money is, but it's okay, trust us. That is not what you do with accountable government in any Western nation. That would be considered an abomination. This is like they've just taken the Berlusconi model and just made it meaner. It's not an acceptable standard. So, Mr. Speaker, what we're talking about here is they say that the money, we're asking about what happened to the money. They can't explain, but they tell us all the good stuff they're doing. Meanwhile, they continue with their cuts. They continue wasting money on their ads. They continue wasting money spying on their own members. They continue wasting money going after civil rights activists like Cindy Blackstock, spying on her, going to court to fight basic things that most Canadians would consider issues of decency and fairness. But those are words that don't belong in this government's lexicon. It makes me think, Mr. Speaker, of Andrew O'Hagan's recent article on Maggie Thatcher, where he said that her legacy was to make England a seedier and greedier place. And the kind of attitude that we're seeing from this government where they've taken the level of partisanship to the level of almost psychosis in dividing Canadians from each other to change the channel on the fact of basic, incompetent mismanagement. I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, if you go into any Tim Hortons in any place in this country and you ask them, is it okay that the government can't find $3.1 billion? Would you trust them? I don't think you'd find a single Canadian who would give the answer yes. And I think it's the contempt that they have for Canadians' taxpayers' dollars with their friends like Mike Duffy, with their friends like Patrick Brazo, with their attitude of their secret contracts, refusing to say whether it's tendered, their refusal to come forward and even be able to produce documents of how money is spent is an example of why this government has lost touch with the Canadian people. I think, Mr. Speaker, what we're asking for in the motion is fairly straightforward. We want to know where the documents are. Is it a case like the president of the Treasury Board who took the $50 million from the border infrastructure and funneled it through his constituency office and buried the paperwork and got away with it? But he buried the paperwork. He hid the paperwork. He said, I'm sorry, there's no paperwork. Well, that wasn't true. There was paperwork. We managed to get a number of it. He did it on his homemade forms. So were they filling out this on homemade forms? They can blame the former Liberals for being part of it, but they should have changed the system. If there was a problem when the Liberals were doing it, they could have changed it, but they didn't. So now we see this level of mendacity, this level of incompetence being shown to the Canadian people in a level of arrogance that they don't believe that they're accountable to explain what happened to $3.1 billion. Mr. Speaker, it's simply not acceptable.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Sault Ste. Marie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My challenge here is that in the normal process, what would happen with this Auditor General's report, in all likelihood, because apparently it contains a little bit of controversy, according to the opposition. In the normal process, it would go to the Public Accounts Committee. And undoubtedly, when your resolution fails, which it will, this is going to go to the Public Accounts Committee. So my question to the member is, does he not think that the Public Accounts Committee is capable of doing their job and bringing forward witnesses and reviewing this report? And considering the Public Accounts Committee is chaired by a member of the opposition, I would think that they would be able to. So that's my question. Would you not agree the proposed resolution is redundant because there's a committee in place that will undoubtedly look at this report and report back to Parliament?
The honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the real question here is not whether I believe that the committee is able to do their job. It's whether I believe the government is doing their job. And clearly, they haven't been. And clearly, the Auditor General supports the position of the New Democratic Party. The government is saying, well, it's just a little bit of controversy. Oh, we lost $3.1 billion. The Auditor General said it's important for there to be a way for people to understand how this money was spent and that summary reporting was not done. Where is this money? It's a simple question. If this government has nothing to hide, then they should be willing to bring forward the documents and exonerate themselves. What they're trying to do is play procedural games to escape from the basic fact that they can't account for $3.1 billion through their own incompetence, and they're hiding whatever documents there are that would show where that money was spent.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Nickel Belt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to ask the honourable member from Timmins. I have a document here in my hands, and this document, it's clearly indicated here. It comes from the Government of Canada. That's that government over there. And it speaks about political party years and surplus number of budgets, and it's about accountability. And I want to quote these numbers. NDP, 48% of the time surplus. That's 65 surplus budgets. Conservatives, 41% of the time. That's 101 deficit budgets. The Liberals, a dismal 27%. That's 80 deficit budgets. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think that these numbers are so important that I would like you to ask unanimous consent for me to table these numbers.
Does the member from Nickel Belt have unanimous consent to table this document? There is no unanimous consent.
See, Mr. Speaker, that's what we're up against. They will say or do anything to keep Canadians from knowing what the real numbers are.
The honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable colleague. We remember in 2008 when the world economy was in the worst tailspin since the Depression, and that the major financial houses in the United States were melting down. And this present Prime Minister said, hey, this is a good time to pick up some deals. That showed what out of touch they were. That they said there would be no spending to stimulate the economy, that they were fine. At this point, they'd already blown through the surplus. They were already going into deficit. And they said, well, you know, if you let the NDP get into power, there might be a $30 billion deficit. Within 3 months, they had racked it up to $50 billion deficit. They had no plan for dealing with the economic crisis at the time because they thought it was a good opportunity to go and pick up some good, easy gifts. It shows, Mr. Speaker, a level of incompetence and a lack of managerial skills in this government that when they lose $3.1 billion, they tell us, don't worry, the money is horizontal. What kind of answer is that to the Canadian taxpayer?
Resuming debate.